Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation by Extinction Rebellion Buddhists called Touching the Earth. It's a talk about the climate crisis and about how Buddhists can make an appropriate response. The main bulk of the talk is given by Joe Mishan, who is one of the co-coordinators for Extinction Rebellion Buddhists. And when the talk begins, in a moment, you'll hear the voice of one of our Buddhist rebels, Amber, reading out some of the facts about the climate crisis and the extinction crisis.
The facts of the climate crisis. The amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere is approaching a level not seen for at least 800,000 years. On our current trajectory, we are heading for a global average temperature increase of at least 3.2% Celsius, which would occur in the next 40 years, according to a recent UN report. Species extinction. This is intensified species extinction, and large parts of the globe would become uninhabitable. We can expect starvation, intensified extreme weather events, mass migration, and armed conflict. To avoid this, we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 45% in the next 8 years. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. 2020 was one of the 3 hottest years on record globally, and all but one of the hottest years on record have occurred in the last 20 years. The Earth's oceans are acidifying, heating up, and rising as a result of atmospheric heating and the carbon dioxide increase. Acidification is causing mass die-offs of coral reefs, which are the breeding ground for many species of fish and feed a large proportion of the world's population. Half of the Great Barrier Reef has been bleached to death since 2016. We can expect further escalation of extreme storms, storm surges, and flooding. This will affect coastal cities and communities across the planet. The rate of extinction of species means that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event. We have already lost 75% of insect species, half of all wildlife, half of our tropical forests, and 24 million people were forced to move due to climate instability last year. Humans, plus domesticated livestock, now account for 96% by biomass of all life on Earth. To take a couple of statistics in detail, we have now lost 90% of our nightingales and 75% of our butterflies. It is important not to forget the fact that poorer communities and countries around the world are the first to experience these impacts, although they have done least to contribute to the problem. James Hansen, former director of NASA, who is outspoken on the climate crisis, has said that the Earth's warming has brought us to the precipice of a great tipping point. If we go over the edge, it will be a transition to a different planet, an environment far outside the range that has been experienced by humanity. There will be no return within the lifetime of any generation that can be imagined, and it will exterminate a large fraction of species on the planet. Is there hope? The chief of the UN Environment Programme said this: "Is it possible to avert disaster? Yes, absolutely. Will it take political will? Yes. Will we need to have the private sector lean in? Yes. But the science tells us that we can do this. There is evidence of waking up to the climate emergency. In a recent poll by the UN of over 1 million people, 2/3 of people across the globe thought that climate change was a global emergency. And business is also waking up. In a recent letter to their investors, BlackRock, the American Investment Corporation and the world's largest asset manager, with 8.67 trillion in assets, said in a letter to their borrowers, "I believe that the pandemic has presented an existential crisis, a stark reminder of our fragility, and it has driven us to confront the global threat of climate change more forcefully and to consider how, like the pandemic, it will alter our lives. It has reminded us how the biggest crises, whether medical or environmental, demand a global and ambitious response."
Okay, thank you, Amber. All right, so I'd just like to invite us all to just take a deep breath and releasing. And just for a moment, allowing the awareness to drop down into the body. And inviting any response to that, any mood or emotion that might have been evoked by those words, by that reality. Not forgetting to feel the body on the chair, the feet on the floor, if you're sitting, and the sense of rootedness that provides. But making welcome, making room for any and all emotion, maybe numbness, maybe fear, maybe grief. Holding it all in love. And then bring yourself back into the room if your eyes are closed, opening them again. So it's with this urgent reality of the climate and ecological crisis, with it clearly in view, that I'd like now to turn to the question, how can our faith tradition hold us in our fear, numbness, heartbreak, and anger as we face into this most momentous of times in our planetary history? How can Buddhism contribute to the change we so urgently need, and to the question, can social engagement contribute and enrich our practice? There's a story from the Zen tradition from the 9th century China, in which a Zen student approaches his dying teacher, the Zen master Wenyan, and asks one of those fairly straightforward questions. He says, "What is the teaching of your entire lifetime?" And the teacher gives a typically pithy Zen reply. He says, "An appropriate response." So I'll be reflecting on how our faith tradition, its history, its wisdom teachings, and our practice offers a way of making an appropriate response to the threat that we now face. An appropriate response, truly wise action, I think, emerges when we move from the heart and mind, or heart-mind, citta. This is the informed heart. And we run into difficulty, I think, when we're out of balance, when we react impulsively out of emotion, or stay distant and act without heart. For action to come out of truth, it must encompass heart and mind. Joanna Macy, who many of you I'm sure will know, who's a Buddhist and a veteran activist, offers us the work that reconnects. And this is a framework of rituals and workshops which facilitates an opening in our hearts and an opening to each other in the midst of this crisis. And it's when we're fully awake to ourselves that our energy is freed, which allows us to act appropriately with freshness and with sustained power. I think it's true to say that our faith tradition equips us well to cultivate and deepen openness to our hearts and minds. It does this through various methods of meditation and ritual. But what does it have to say about meeting the world in a state of crisis, about going out into the world as we now find it? So in the light of this, I'd like to begin by looking at how Buddhists have, in the past, have responded to the social and political issues that had affected their world. It's worth remembering that the Buddha in his time was actively engaged in politics and society. For example, he included women in the monastic community, although I have to say there's some ambiguity in the scriptures about that. He was openly opposed to the caste system. He opposed animal sacrifice. He spoke of the responsibilities of the rich to share their wealth. And he involved himself with princes and kings and offered them advice and wisdom. And since the Buddha's time, the engagement of Buddhists in the political and social world has a long and venerable tradition. There are many contemporary examples of engaged Buddhists from the Thai monastic monks who ordained trees to stop them being cut down, and there's a recent book being written about that, to the Cambodian monks and nuns who set up AIDS clinics in Cambodia. There are a lot of organizations which currently promote engagement, and to name just a few, there's One Earth Sangha, which some of you may know, which runs an eco-sattva course. There's Eco-Dharma, of which I'm part, that emerged out of the network of Buddhist organizations. And there's the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, and that's just to name a few. It was actually Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh who first used the term engaged Buddhism in the 1960s in Vietnam. In speaking about the beginnings of engaged Buddhism at the time, he said the following. When I was in Vietnam, so many of our villages were being bombed, along with my monastic brothers and sisters. I had to decide what to do. Should we continue to practice in our monasteries, or should we leave the meditation halls in order to help the people who are suffering under the bombs? After careful reflection, we decided to do both, to go out and help people, and to do so in mindfulness. We called this engaged Buddhism. He says, mindfulness must be engaged. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. We must be aware of the real problems of the world. Then with mindfulness, we will know what to do and what not to do to be of help. So in my own rather more modest way, I've been through something of this process. It wasn't the Vietnam War and we weren't being bombed. It was actually a regular meeting in a house in South London. But the subject matter was how to set up a dance group, Dharma Action Network group in London, and what we should do. So I think this was about 2016, if I remember correctly, 2016, 17. For about a year we met to wrestle really as a group about how we could enter the fray. So what did the questions like, what did Buddhist action look like? What was effective but still within the precepts? Was protest of any kind too confrontational? And this was the view of some people. And many people left during these discussions. It wasn't until we thought of taking the act of meditation into the outside world that things really started to make sense, and the group really formed. It seemed kind of obvious then that this is what we should have done, and it actually felt immediately just right, really. and in some ways easy because we all knew how to meditate. Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's an activist, a monk, translator of the Pali text, said of the climate crisis, he said rather beautifully, "We are invited not to panic, but to decisively and fiercely respond." So this is very direct, it's inspiring, the invitation to act with power and without apology, but crucially, I think, to respond rather than to react. And surely it's vital to respond with urgency, which is appropriate to the crisis. And there's a Buddhist word some of you may know, which is a Pali word, samvega, which sort of means spiritual urgency. And it usually refers to the realities of samsara, the realities of old age, sickness and death, and that when we grasp this fully, then we can be filled with urgency and with power and act from wisdom and clarity. And I think there's a direct parallel there between grasping the issues of old age, sickness and death and grasping the realities of the climate and ecological crisis. But as we respond, where do we turn in our wisdom tradition for guidance, for clarity, as we turn towards action? I found that the Brahma Viharas, the 4 so-called divine abodes of the heart, are an essential route to stabilize us as we enter the fray. They're a guide and a compass, as well as a gift to the activist community. And I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the Brahma Viharas, which are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So I'd like to look at these qualities of the heart now in some depth and reflect on how our embodiment of them contributes to the climate movement and can be nourished by our engagement in the movement. I'd like to focus on compassion actually, and equanimity particularly, partly for reasons of time, and partly because compassion and equanimity really stood out for me in my reflections and in my activist experience. This isn't to say that joy and loving kindness or friendliness are not important. In fact, joy is a surprisingly frequent visitor in my experience. There's such a lot of creativity, courage, and beauty that arises when a group of people start acting inspired by a common cause and the benefit of all. And joy arises quite spontaneously in that environment. And loving kindness offers a friendly hand when we make mistakes, as we inevitably do. When ourselves or others stray from what we consider good or wholesome. Of course, all the Brahma Viharas are interrelated and not really separate. They comprise what Vinnie Ferraro calls the 4 flavors of love. And each Brahma Vihara supports and gives color and substance to the other. So really it's a matter of emphasis. It's simply my experience that the qualities of compassion and equanimity are the most vivid or foremost of the heart qualities which are called forth in the field of activism. So I'd like to start with compassion. The quality of compassion has a central role in providing a wholesome source of inspiration and of strength. And I'm going to invite Amber now to read a passage from one of our group members, one of our Extinction Rebellion Buddhist Dharma friends. Amber, would you read from Alan, please? Thank you.
I meditate on taking suffering from others and giving them my happiness, a Tibetan practice called Tonglen. For example, during the fires in Australia or the Amazon, I imagine the suffering of being an animal burned alive and take that suffering. Also, sometimes I imagine the world in a couple of decades, when the ecological situation is much worse and societies are much more broken, and take the suffering of future generations. These practices give me a lot of strength of compassion to know that I have to do something, whatever, and not just let it happen.
Thank you, Anna. So I think that in moving from compassion in this way, Buddhists offer these benefits to the activist community. Firstly, I think it provides resilience. When we act from compassion for those beings who are and will be affected by climate impacts, we draw on an inexhaustible source of inspiration, which is that of love for all we hold dear. Secondly, a focus on compassion for all beings guards against succumbing to getting lost in anger, in blame and bitterness, which is a route to burnout for so many activists. And thirdly, it reduces the tendency to othering, which, as I'll go into later in a bit more detail, it could be argued is the root of our present climate, ecological and social crises. And finally, coming from compassion is just a much more effective tactic in my view. So for example, we might declare our opposition to a corporation's action or inaction, but we maintain a position of care and concern for the individuals working in it, because they'll also be subject to the effects of the climate crisis. And in this way, we're much more likely to win over hearts and minds than if we're lost in expressing anger and ill will. And I'd like to extend the reach and influence of compassion and to submit that compassion is the heart quality that opens us into the lived experience of interdependence. What I mean here is that compassion naturally opens hearts beyond our small sense of self, into a connection to all others and ultimately to all beings. In this state, we feel in our bones, as it were, and in our hearts, the truth of interconnectedness. Interconnectedness or dependent origination is one of the fundamental Buddhist wisdom teachings on the nature of reality. It teaches that nothing exists independently of other phenomena. This is the true nature of our ecosystems, for example, on the planet. And this core teaching is something that our industrial society has forgotten to our immense cost. We might say it is the center of the whole problem. It is this illusion of separateness, referred to by Einstein, strangely enough, as an optical delusion of consciousness that has allowed us to exploit other species and to marginalize non-dominant groups and communities while we remain indifferent to their suffering. And we've also developed an economic system which reflects this delusional state. As long as we're putting the feelings of others out of our hearts, then we're free to exploit, neglect, and abuse them, and to neglect and abuse life on our planet. But when through compassion, we can feel the impacts of our exploitation of people and planet as personally as if it were happening to ourselves or our own family, we'll be constitutionally unable to continue to do these things. As the Metta Sutta says so evocatively, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. So I'd like to turn now to the quality of equanimity. And to go back to Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, he wrote, when the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats met with storms or pirates, if everyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even one person on the boat remained calm and centered, it was enough. It showed the way for everyone to survive. So all of our groups, all of our actions involve either sitting or walking meditation and chanting, or all of these. Sitting or walking in meditation in the midst of the intensity and turmoil of street action is, I think, the embodiment of what Thich Nhat Hanh is referring to here. And I'm going to show you some photos of our group in action, and I'm just going to kind of scroll through them and just to invite you to notice what arises in you as you do this. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen, which I'm sure will happen completely smoothly. Okay. Okay. So I'm not going to say much about it. This is 2019, April 2019. In fact, before the formation of XR Buddhists, it was Dharma Action Network. And we're sitting across the road near Marble Arch in meditation. There's about 40 of us. You can't see everyone there. So this is us more recently, I think August 2020. You might notice some culprits there. This is us, again, I think November 2019, walking around Trafalgar Square. Worth mentioning that I think after this and after many of our meditation sits, we were joined spontaneously by other activists in meditation and actually also just members of the public who came to meditate with us. And that's us sitting outside and one of us is inside Barclays. The blindfolds are linked to the placards which read Barclays blind to the climate crisis. Okay. That's that. Stop share. Okay. So yeah, just an invitation to allow what arose in you when you looked at those photos. I'm hoping that you'll agree with me when I say that this, our actions are an embodied equanimity in action. I'd like to make the case that the communication of equanimity through public meditation is XR Buddhists' unique contribution to Extinction Rebellion. I refer to the qualities of groundedness, deep presence and stillness that I hope was evident to you as you looked at these photos. In my experience, this brings a quality of calmness, determination, power to street actions, which can often be noisy and intense. These qualities reduce the likelihood of verbal or physical violence on either side, while simultaneously, I think, increasing the power of the protest. So take a moment to consider the rarity of stillness in our fast-moving, goal-orientated culture. Stillness and poise in the midst of the cacophony of city life, I think, is a declaration of refusal to be swept up in it all, a kind of holding action against the stream, a stream that is rapidly leading us off the edge of a cliff. This, I think, is a deep insistence on being, which is a revolutionary act in a world of doing. The capacity for equanimity is also essential for us personally, to hold the pain, the grief, the anger which is inherent in ecological awareness, and the sheer uncertainty and unpredictability of the effects of our actions. Street activism is a challenge to our capacity for equanimity, but I would argue that this challenge, like the internal challenges that arise during meditation practice, is a spur for spiritual development. Joanna Macy writes, "It is my experience that the world itself has a role to play in our liberation. Its very pressures, its pains and risks can wake us up, release us from the bonds of ego, and guide us home to our vast true nature." So just to mention that my own personal experience of sitting in the streets of London, I was amazed from really the beginning about how entirely possible it is to meditate on a busy street, and actually how interesting it is to do it. It certainly challenged my capacity to tolerate vulnerability and fear. But unexpectedly, I was rather surprised by how very peaceful it can be at times. And I think it's developed my own confidence in my capacity for equanimity and very much deepened my connection with my group and my gratitude for being with others who have the courage to take action like this. I just want to mention, just checking the time. Yeah. Just to mention the importance of community, which obviously isn't one of the Brahmaviharas, but essential, I think, to activist life, as it is to Buddhist life. You will probably be aware that in the scriptures, Ananda, who to my memory often gets things wrong, said to the Buddha, he said that the Sangha, the community, the Buddhist community, was half the holy life. And the Buddha replied, "Do not say so, Ananda. It is the whole of the holy life." And it's interesting that when Joanna Macy was asked how she'd managed with the inevitable despair during her long activist career and how she hadn't succumbed to that, she said simply, "Never act alone." It's interesting. She'd obviously never met Greta Thunberg, but I think she's probably one of a kind. So I'm going to invite Amber now to read something from Kate to illustrate this point about community. Thanks, Amber.
Last rebellion, there was one day after the protests that had effectively been banned, where we were marching, and I felt really intimidated by the number of police. Police standing on the side of the road, police on horses, police in helicopters. I must have looked terrified. A fellow rebel saw my tears and was kind. That helped me to go on. I felt fear, but I also felt intensely connected to my values and this community of like-minded people. For me, it's really important, not just that I protest, but also how. And I'm glad to have found a way with XR and XR Buddhists to stand for what I believe in and hopefully make a change.
Thank you, Amber. So I think I've got time to just say a few words about Extinction Rebellion, so that you can get a sense of where Buddhism might intersect with it. I think the best way of doing that, actually the simplest and in some ways the quickest, is just to invite Satya to read what's called the Vision Reminder. And the Vision Reminder is something that can be read out to the the group who's just about to take an action, they're called affinity groups within Extinction Rebellion, wrote out to the affinity group before any action. So Satya, would you read us that, please? Thanks.
Let us take a moment to consider why we are here. Let's recall our love for the whole of humanity in all corners of the world. Let's remember our love for this beautiful planet that feeds, nourishes, and sustains all life. Let's recollect our sincere desire to protect all this for now and for generations to come. As we act today, may we find the courage to bring this sense of peace and appreciation to everyone we encounter, to every word we speak, and to every action we make. In this emergency, together, rooted in love, we are all we need.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure that was written by, I don't know who it was written by, but I'm sure it must have been a person of faith, of which there are many in Extinction Rebellion, and of course of which we're part. It's also, just to mention, comes out of the regenerative, so-called regenerative culture, which Extinction Rebellion has embodied really, or embedded in its movement. And a regenerative culture is one that has a kind of capacity to bounce back from stress and strain and failure through the connection, physical, spiritual, emotional connection between members of the organization, of the group. During the writing of of my presentation, I listened to a talk from a Vipassana teacher who may or may not know, called Mark Coleman, who runs retreats called, or used to run retreats called Awake in the Wild, in the outdoors. And this particular talk was called Wise Action in a Time of Ecological Crisis. He said to his audience on it was a rural retreat in America, which he was running, he said, go into the woods and meditate, fall in love. If only the US Congress would come and sit in the woods here and let lizards climb over them and listen to the birds, maybe they'd become activists too. Well, this really made an impact on me. My meditation practice and my engagement with activism has really worked together to intensify and expand my sensitivity to compassion, to a compassionate openness to the suffering of our planet. And I believe I'm not alone in this increase in sensitivity, and it's evident to me from conversations with Dharma friends that our actions in Extinction Rebellion Buddhists stem from and are rooted in appreciation, care, and compassion and love for this astonishing blue-green planet we call home. I'd like to invite Amber now to read, in the light of this, a slightly longer entry from one of our Triratna friends within XR Buddhists. Thank you, Amber. If you could read from Jack. Thank you.
I think activism has helped me develop deeper metta, equanimity, and even insight. I notice that I generally feel much less angry about these issues than I did, and I'm glad not to be so angry. Anger can be a positive energy for me, but can also take me into tiredness and depression. I've done a lot of reflecting on the impermanence of everyone and everything I love, including the beauty and impermanence of the natural world itself. I've been almost forced to clarify, what do I really think? What are my values? What do I really care about? I've been almost forced to look after my heart, to nourish and connect with my spiritual inspiration, a deeper energy. And my heart has opened, keeps opening more to the power of Sangha, the extraordinary beauty of other people's idealism which inspires and sustains me. I feel free, richer, happier, and more authentically myself. I do actually feel like I've been touching the earth more, coming into a closer relationship with reality, both internally and externally.
Beautiful, very powerful. Thank you. Thank you, Amber. I'm convinced, friends, that we need to find a way to fall in love again with this chaotic, tragic, painfully beautiful, intimately interconnected planet. And we need to do it utterly, fiercely, and intelligently. Only love can provide us with the inexhaustible energy and power that we need to face the trials of the path at this time. But this love needs to be balanced by wisdom and held in equanimity. And by wisdom, I mean we should only love what is true and wholesome. And by equanimity, I mean that we hold this love and act from it, but without falling into sentimentality. And I'm here thinking of Martin Luther King's statement when he says, "Power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic." And I'm also thinking of Lila June, an inspiring Indigenous environmental scientist, community organizer and musician, when she says, "Truth, faith, and love are your greatest weapons." And if you haven't looked actually at Lila June's website or her talks, I urge you to do that. She's obviously from an Indigenous American background, but frankly, if she isn't a Buddhist, she ought to be. So I think it all comes down to this then. How to nurture the conditions in which love can flourish and how we can act from it. This, I think, is an appropriate response. And how we can express it in ways that can help it ripple out into the world. We are all, after all, I think, struggling with wounds of separation. Separation from ourselves, the wisdom of our ancestors, separation from others in their splendid multitude of forms, and separation from this earth and from the sacred. I think a mature activist community is one that is declarative and offering. It declares that a system that is failing and harmful should be changed, and it offers a different way, a different account of what really matters. And what really matters in the end is love. And when we follow the demands of love, we reconnect with all that we have lost and forgotten. We reconnect with the truth of interconnection. And I think this is really nothing new to Buddhists. Isn't this the path we're all on anyway? As the small sense of self falls away and we connect with something bigger, all that is left is love. We find ourselves in a rich world of intimate interconnection. I thought maybe what we need is a declaration of interdependence. And I'd like to invite Satya to read a poem now by Mary Oliver, which speaks directly to this cultivation of the expansive heart.
Thank you, Joe. The title of this poem is Lead, and it refers to lead in fishing equipment that dissolves into the water. Lead. Here is a story to break your heart. Are you willing? This winter, the loons came to our harbour and died one by one of nothing we could see. A friend told me of one on the shore that lifted its head and opened the elegant beak and cried out in the long, sweet savouring of its life, which, if you have heard it, you know is a sacred thing, and for which, if you have not heard it, you had better hurry to where they still sing. And believe me, tell no one just where that is. The next morning, this loon, speckled and iridescent, and with a plan to fly home to some hidden lake, was dead on the shore. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Satya. Satya said she would cry when she read that, and I said I would too. So, yeah, let's just spend a little minute just to allow that into our hearts. Thank you. And so, friends, to conclude, I believe that at this most critical and momentous of time, the climate crisis needs Buddhism. Our commitment to acknowledging the truth of the way things are without looking away, and crucially, our capacity for love and equanimity in the face of this crisis. As Mark Coleman has said, the world has heard from scientists, it has heard from politicians and from technical experts. What do we contemplatives have to say?